Jasna, are you online? If Jasna, you're online, can you go ahead and start with the program?
Yes, I am. I'm
Okay,
there.
thank you.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's start.
Let's begin the event. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's begin the. Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin the event. First of all, really sorry for the delay that was caused. We were just waiting for a few more participants to join. Anyways, let's begin. To improve the golden moment of the good that is in our reach is the great art of life. A warm good morning to a galaxy of intellectuals, our invited guests, professors, respected teachers, and my dear students to this magnificently glorious day. You're all listening to Jasna Jose, Assistant Professor, English Department, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor, and I have been bestowed the privilege to anchor and host this event. First of all, on behalf of the institution and the English department, I wholeheartedly welcome you all to this enlightening talk in the topic Theory of Literary Translation, organized by the Department of English in conjunction with Quaesitio 2022-23, the multidisciplinary online international conference. A love of learning, a longing for discovery, and a commitment to pursue the truth are the pillars that build a healthy environment between any student and institution. Thus, drawing inspiration from the motto of our to be a part of this comprehensive and cross-disciplinary event. So, without any delay, let me get into the duties bestowed upon me. Honorable guests, respected teachers, and beloved students, let's begin today's auspicious event by seeking the praise of the Almighty to be our hope, light, strength, and comfort. I now call upon Anju Mary Anil to lead us into prayer and invoke the Almighty. Over to you.
There shall be showers of blessing. This is the promise of love. There shall be seasons refreshing, sent from the Savior above. Showers of blessing, showers of blessings we need. Mercy drops round us are falling, but for the showers we plead. There shall be showers of blessing, precious reviving again. Over the hills and the valleys, sound of abundance of rain. Showers of blessing, showers of blessings we need. Mercy drops round us are falling, but for the showers we plead. But for the showers we plead.
Thank you, Anju. It was indeed heart-touching. Next, let me invite one of the pillars of this event. I'm the English Department Coordinator of Quaesitio. Her undivided commitment to this program is sure to shine, and I'm pretty sure you all will stand testimony for the hard work she and the team has put into this event. To give a red carpet welcome to everyone assembled here, I invite Ms. Tina Jose, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. Okay.
Yes, you are, ma'am.
Thank you. There is little in life as so reassuring as a genuine welcome, said writer Robin Hobb. A hearty good morning to you all, a hearty good night or good evening to our guests, and a warm welcome to the third Quaesitio of St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor. I'm extremely delighted to be able to welcome you all to the English division of Quaesitio 2023. First and foremost, I would like to welcome our dear Judy, Ms. Vijayamol Tangachin, to this gathering. I next extend a hearty welcome to our ever-supportive principal, Dr. Stephen Martin. I would also like to welcome our chief guest for today, Ms. Janet Elizabeth Lee, for kindly consenting to be a part of our program despite her busy schedule and the tight between time. Our chair cum judge for today is Dr. Vimal Mohan John of SB College, Shagnasheri. I welcome you, sir, most sincerely to Quaesitio. I also welcome our other two judges for today, Ms. Navida Elizabeth Jones and Mr. Jimmy James, faculty at St. Stephen's College. To this gathering. I would also like to welcome all the participants in today's session and wish them all the best. Last but not least, I welcome our dear teachers and students to this gathering. Welcome everyone once again.
Thank you, Tina ma'am, for being the rock for this event and for kickstarting the event with absolute enthusiasm. Next, without any further delay, I invite Ms. Ruti Elsa Jose, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor, for the introduction of our
Thank you, Ms. Jesna. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to introduce the multifaceted and resourceful speaker of today, Ms. Janet Elizabeth Lee. Ma'am, first of all, a huge thanks from the bottom of our hearts for agreeing to do this talk with us, despite all your busy schedule. Now, I would like to add a few lines of introduction about our speaker. Ms. Janet is a French-English language translator based in Brooklyn, as well as a host of Another Way to Say reading series in translation. Her editorial interests include building digital platforms that encourage exploration and interaction with dense text, comparative analysis of source and target. At the Le Festival des Continents and La Maison Fazes NYU. She is currently translating Josephine by Jean Rollin and Eve Deco by Maria Cacuggiani. Today, Ms. Janet would be addressing us on the topic, Theory of Literary Translation. Ms. Janet, welcome to the session. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, the Department of English, and also thank you, professors all. This is a really wonderful opportunity to be speaking about some.
Yeah, I just want to interrupt you. I'm so sorry to do this, but we have one more person who would like to talk. Do you mind if I hold on for a minute?
Okay.
Sure, thank you. Yasna, please go ahead.
Janet, ma'am, really sorry for the interruption that was happening, that happened right now. So now I invite our pillar and our HOD for the felicitation. Before that, just an introductory note. A pessimist complains about the wind, an optimist tries to change it, and a leader adjusts the sails. The sails and direction of this event was adjusted by a person who's not only a great motivation to all of us, but an inspiration who gave us the belief to put this event together. She is none other than our beloved HOD. May I take the pleasure of requesting Ms. Lydia Moltangachan, the head of the department and assistant professor, Department of English, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor, to grace the occasion by her words. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jasna. A very good morning to the respected chief guests, all the faculty members, participants, and everyone present here. This day marks the adventurous academic exploration of Quaesitio, our research venture. With much pleasure, I would like to wish all the very best to our vibrant, young, eminent scholar, Miss Janet Elizabeth Lee, our chief guest. I especially thank and congratulate our faculty member, Ms. Tina Jos, for the effort she has taken to conduct Quaesitio. And I think that it's my privilege to wish good luck to every partaker of this seminar. Let me conclude by wishing everyone, each and everyone of you, a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia ma'am, for the warm words. And now I invite Ms. Janet for the session and for the talk in the session, that is Theory of Literary Translation. Over to you, ma'am. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your welcome. And thank you to everyone who put this together. This is really wonderful. It's an honor to speak about literature itself. So, of course, we're eventually going to talk about machine translation. I imagine in the question and answer portion, there'll be plenty of questions dealing with machine translation, that is Google Translate or Babbel or other new technologies that help us translate. But I think it's good to start in the 3rd century, because even as early as the 3rd century, translators were already considerably better than machines. That is, they already discovered that word-by-word translations deliver a very subpar translation. So at the time, just to set up a sort of, I guess, geological, political stage, at the time of the 3rd century in which we're looking at, classic Greek literature was translated into Latin by a select few of scholars in the Roman Empire. And it wasn't a generous or a diplomatic way of translating. It was very much in tandem, or it was very much in line with their relationship to Greece, in that they were plundering and stealing and enslaving what was once Greek and transforming it into Roman culture. So translation at the time was actually pretty violent, in the sense that they were appropriate. He's definitely a big deal. He's portrayed here, and he usually is portrayed in his study, working, translating probably. He was drinking a lot and partying a lot, but in the middle of his life, he had a moment in which he decided to reorient himself and dedicate his life to the gospel. He was also one of the only scholars at the time who could speak Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and of course Latin. This is a timeline of Bible translation. And we are here in 3rd century AD. At the time, the Old Testament had already been translated from Hebrew. into Greek. And that was a massive undertaking that was done by 70 scholars. And it was a moment of incredible cohesion, to the extent that the Greek scriptures were actually, in many minds, more divine than the original Hebrew. Jerome, however, decided to do things in a very unprecedented way. He was the first person to not only translate the entire work into Latin, but he was also the first person to translate from the original Hebrew and cross-reference that with the Greek, and then annotate the entire document, describing how the Hebrew and the Greek differed from each other to account for an evolution of faith or mistranslation over the centuries. This was considered the Vulgate, and it was the standard within the Roman Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. Now, of course, modern scholars have found discrepancies within Jerome's own text, and there's of course a lot of sympathy where Jerome spoke better Greek than he did Hebrew. When in doubt, he would of course return to the Greek text, which meant that a very thorough translation wouldn't happen until much later. But the project took him 23 years to complete and was truly unprecedented in terms of literary translation and what one person can do in this field. Here's a picture of, not of course the original Hebrew manuscript, because we don't have any. At most we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which wouldn't be as old as what Jerome would be working from. But you see here the Hebrew text alongside Greek text, and then on far to the right side of the screen here is the Vulgate. Now, we don't have too much insight to his process, but we do have a few letters from Jerome, because he was constantly having to defend his method of translating within his immediate church and his immediate community. There was an instance in which a letter he had translated for a friend was actually stolen from his desk and then shared amongst people that then analyzed it and determined that he was not a faithful translator. So he wrote a letter to defend this particular instance. So, of course, he translated many other documents besides the Bible. And in this letter, he described a method that builds on all of the methods employed by the translators of the Greek classics, in which a translation is not word for word, but sense for sense, which is a very slippery, difficult thing to really pin down, because essentially it means that you're gathering a meaning from what you're reading beyond the words themselves. So I have a quote here. Indeed, I not only admit, but freely proclaim that in translation, interpretione from the Greek, except in the case of sacred scripture, where the very order of the words is a mystery, I render not word for word, but sense for sense. In this matter, I have the guidance of Cicero, who translated Plato's Patagoras, and Xenophon's Oikonomachus, and the two most beautiful orations that Aeneas and Demosthenes delivered against each other. And how much he, that is Cicero, the translator of Plato, changed in order to display the properties of another language through the properties of his own, there is not enough time to say. So to summarize that rather dense quote, it's been standing tradition, even as early as 300 AD, that there was not necessarily direct translation, but it was paraphrasing or adaptation. In fact, you'll notice that translation as a word didn't even exist. We have in brackets interpretatione from the Greek, which of course is the root for interpretation, but it's much less rigid of a concept than translation. There's much more freedom in interpretation or interpreter to reorder the words in the moment, or to paraphrase, or to cut things out, to add things just to assist in understanding from the readers. Then Jerome goes on in the letter to quote Cicero directly. I have converted the most celebrated orations of two of the most eloquent Attic orators, Aeneas and Demonethes, which they delivered in debate against each other, not recasting them as a translator, interpres, but as an orator, keeping the same meaning, but adapted to our idiom. I have not thought it necessary to pay out one word for another in this process, but have conserved the character and the force of the language, nor have I thought it fitting to count them out to the reader, but to weigh them out. Translators use a lot of interesting metaphors to explain what's happening, because this idea of sense for sense is so vague. We have this character and force of the language and the weight of a word as opposed to the unit. There's a lot, there's a lot of ways we can go with this, but I think one of the things we need to keep in mind going forward is, as I've been saying, even as early as the 3rd century, translators have already recognized that word-for-word translation is never quality writing. Trading out one word in one language for a corresponding word in another is not sufficient to convey the harder to replicate meaning of a literary document. And yet, we see that Jerome feels the need to defend this. That is, though the translators have long been working in this way, define the sort of word-for-word interpretation, the public at large seems to be operating under the impression that that is what's happening, and that translation should be always faithful and be replicating as if you were perhaps exchanging money, as simple as that. And the need for translator staff to continually explain to the public that that's not exactly what's happening is something that will actually be timeless. So even though Jerome says in the letter that he doesn't operate in a word-for-word translation, he does make an exception, and that is for sacred scripture. So while he is saying word for word does not work and defends a more paraphrasing or a mode of translation that actually kind of adapts rather than directly literally translates something, he does plant a seed for something that will develop into an ambition by many translators, and many modern translators especially starting out. And that ambition is to be utterly faithful to the text. So this, of course, the word faithful itself is also interesting because it is a development of the translation of religious texts, with this idea that you cannot change and you cannot reorganize the orders of the words. The second quote here is actually from Martin Luther, who, let me see if I can pull up the timeline again for you. So Martin Luther, he's much further ahead in 1534. He was one of the first to translate the Bible into German, not the first, but one of the first. And his project was very focused on giving a German public, a common German public, the ability to read the Bible as opposed to depending upon a priest who could speak in Latin. Okay. And do let me know if I'm going too quickly.
No, this is good. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So here's this again. As I just said, words and syntax in this idea of faithfulness. Words and syntax have a divinely imposed order, and the reason for it is not something that a mortal can challenge or understand. The second figure that defined in a real way translation theory in the West is a man named Nicolas Perrault d'Ablancourt. He was considerably after Jerome. We're jumping to the 17th century France, right in the middle of the Renaissance. He's where Saint Jerome was the patron saint of translators. D'Ablancourt was actually the patron saint, shall we say, of a phrase in Italian, traditore, which means to translate is to betray. Of course, that has a nice assonance in Italian that doesn't translate into English. But the amusement that translation is so close to the word for betray or traitor in Italian is something that was used in common jest, especially around this time, because the mode of translation at the time was to take the original text, often a Greek classic, and transform it into something for a noble court, which means, and I'm going to just read some sections in bold here. This means that the best translations seem to be the least faithful. So this is the preface to Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian and politician, and is considered by many scholars today as one of Rome's greatest historians. Apologies, there's a typo there. One of Rome's greatest historians. So the court, and of course, Nicolas Perrault d'Ablancourt, in their grand effort to translate all of the Greek classics that they could, and the Roman classics that they could, would include historians as well. But even historians were treated to the same sort of ornation and even what they would call improvement, what we would perhaps in modern times refer to as editing in addition to translating, because d'Ablancourt was known for taking a text and then making it more flowery, more charming, something that you would present as an orator in front of the ladies at court. In his preface to his translation of this Roman historian, he bemoans the fact different mode of being, unless one wishes to create a monstrous body, such as those of ordinary translations, which are either dead and listless or confused and muddled without any order or charm. So he goes on to say that paradoxically, even though it may seem that you're being unfaithful, it's actually, in the larger scheme of things, better to the author to improve upon him and to explain to perhaps an ignorant public what he meant to say, or perhaps what is said in a better way, than to allow what he's calling an ordinary translation to not resonate with the public who will be reading and receiving him. So he has a point in the sense that because of him, in part, and his very ornate translations, which were doctored to the extent that, again, in modern times, we would not even consider them translations. It was thanks to his translations that the French public fell in love with Greek literature and the Roman classics. Nevertheless, he had a lot of critics, and his translations were referred to as les belles infidèles, as in the beautiful unfaithful things. So this is pulled directly from the French Larousse, and the translation is right beneath it. For some, his translation served as a model for French prose, and for others, it was an accumulation of inaccuracies. Even France's most famous writer of the Renaissance, or I guess the latter end of the Renaissance, Voltaire, was very critical of his way of translating. Nevertheless, his way of translating became very standard and was known as the French school, one that prioritized the sensibility of French readers and the beauty of the French language over whatever was linguistically unique to the original Greek and Latin. And this became a standard feature of text translated throughout the French Renaissance. As a quick aside, even though we actually won't have time to address this because we're only going to the 1950s, in the latter half of the 20th century, this terminology, les belles infidèles, would be reappropriated by feminists to describe an engaged sort of feminist reading with a text, but that is considerably later on in translation. So here we have a brief note on Anne Dacier, who came just after Nicolas Perrault d'Ablancourt. She was one of the few detractors of this style of translating that was meant to keep the beauty of the French language to the detriment, perhaps, of what was actually going on in the original language and the original text. So she was inspired after an especially terrible translation of Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Iliad came out to undertake translation herself. She worked from the original Greek texts, and her ambition was to realize a version that was faithful to the originals. She very much is an outlier of the time period. And if you actually read her translations now, they still read as someone trying to improve a bit upon the Greek or upon the Latin, because she was very much of her time, and even the rebels of a certain time period can't completely exist outside of it. But she's important to be looking at right now because the fact that she was translating so faithfully inspired a lot of critique, not necessarily because of her translations, but because being faithful to the translation or being faithful to the original text meant that she was including references to Greek and Roman sexual mores that were completely just not something discussed in society, in French society at the time. It was also quite jarring to be reading such a stark language when French, of course, was much more flowery. And she didn't necessarily, her mode of translation didn't necessarily stick the way that Ablancourt did, but she's an important feature, an important figure in what was otherwise a very male-dominated field. So to summarize, Les Belles Infidèles, there's this idea of bringing the author to the reader, so changing the author in order to please the reader, or what we will call later, domesticating the text. Versus the faithful text or faithful translation, which Goethe would later describe as simple prose. So now we have Goethe. So Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, he was a good 100 years after Ablancourt, and a lot has happened in Europe since then. He is the presenter of the third option. So not one and not two, which we just saw there, but a third option, which honestly, even today is rather mysterious. I don't know that anyone has actually been able to attain his ideal of a good translation. Very quickly, Goethe was someone who wasn't necessarily a translator himself, but simply perhaps the most famous German novelist ever. I'm going to read really quickly. Constructed, it appeared to him that in his original German, he was fascinated by the translation of his writing into other languages, and he was quick to acknowledge the important role of translation in modern culture. Literature, he believed, was writing. World literature was the term he coined for it. That would be international in scope and readership. The introduction goes on. He would be delighted to learn that there's so much work to it. The text that amount of poetry that had only just been translated into French and German, and he was endlessly studying and endlessly inspired for his own work by the translations of this poetry. So after much study and assessment and reading of these translations, he came up with this concept that there are three kinds of translation. Okay, so we have the original text. Then we have what he called the plain prose translation, or as we saw in the case of Anne, something that is as faithful as it can be, nothing extra or ornate. Then we have what is definitely the French school, the almost like parody or parodistic style in which the text is quote unquote improved upon, but actually it's a considerable distance now from the original text. His idea is to kind of complete the circle. And he has this idea of a perfect interlinear translation. To this day, I think most contemporary translators will have a difficult time describing exactly what this is. Because Goethe, on the one hand, has this idea that if you stick closely enough to the original text, you'll be able to force open the target language in such a way that you enrich it, that the target language will eventually be able to absorb these new concepts and even the new grammar and the new syntax. Yet at the same time, it's clear he wants something beautiful, something that you can read. So it's a fine line, actually, between adhering too closely to something that's so foreign. Because again, a word-for-word translation, as even the ancients recognized, and we can see this easily if we were to go over to Google Translate right now and try to translate some poems from the Persian, most of them would be very bad. So we know that word-by-word translation usually doesn't work. But Goethe insists that there's a sort of like middle space, this third option. And I think, at least for myself and the contemporary translators that I'm working with now, this is the sort of ground, this meeting point that we're all trying to reach. There's a very sort of subjective relationship to the interlinear space. But I have here, of course, the passage from the West Easterly Divan. So I will just read the last, let's see, the last paragraph of that very quickly. Okay. A translation that attempts to identify itself with the original ultimately comes close to an interlinear version and greatly facilitates our understanding of the original. We are led, yes, compelled as it were, back to the source text, the circle within which the approximation of the foreign and the familiar, the known and the unknown constantly move. I do wish he had an example for us describing exactly what is a perfect interlinear translation. But it's much like Plato's forms in the sense that this is the idea or the ideal. And we do want to perform as translators in such a way the author and the original text is not utterly erased by what we're doing. We also hope that what we're adding to our own literary landscape changes it in, if not language itself. But we also want it to be read. We also want the most people possible to engage with it. So we can't be making the text unnecessarily difficult. And this is, of course, the constantly moving target that we're dealing with now, this sort of strange interlinear space. Although, of course, we're not going to end there. Vladimir Nabokov, the ultimate foreignizer, was certainly not the most prolific translation theorist of this time. We're now in 1955 when he wrote an essay called Problems of Translation. And even after in translation literary theory means that he's along with the postmodernists, a movement that is typified by its pessimism, deconstruction, and the images I chose were from an article in which it describes the falling out with his friend. Not necessarily the most important. So I'll just read the quote here. I want translations with copious footnotes. Footnotes reaching up like skyscrapers to the top of this or that page, so as to leave only a gleam of one textual line between commentary and eternity. I want footnotes and the absolutely literal sense with no emasculation and no padding. I want such sense and such notes for all the poetry in other tongues that still languishes in poetical versions, be grimed and be slimed by rhyme. It's kind of funny that he has be grimed and be slimed, which rhymes by rhyme. Okay, so in this article, this essay called Problems of Translation, in which he describes the arduous task of translating, I guess very quickly, just so we have a sense of what we're dealing with and also what Nabokov was dealing with when he was trying to translate on again. So he just forth on whether or not it can be classified as a novel or a poem. But it is one of Pushkin's, the Russian novelist Pushkin's, most famous work. The events take place between the end of 1819 and the spring of 1825. And the scenes throughout the novel shift from the capital to the countryside, and thence to Moscow and then to St. Petersburg. It's definitely very modern in its ambition. There's, in one instance, a scene in town from the perspective of a sort of wayward young man, and then it turns to a rural landscape and the libraries in the countryside, and then it turns to perhaps a dream and a duel. It's a very surreal for its time. It's a very surreal text. It's notoriously difficult to translate, and furthermore, it has a very rigid rhyme scheme. So, when he was translating, he found that the only way he could possibly be satisfied with his translation is to annotate it to death. And his manuscripts just have red ink in the margins describing the insufficiency of English in this area and this area. To only realize that the footnotes themselves can carry a translation, in the sense that though on again may never be perfectly translated into English because it's so difficult to do so, the hypothetically exist if someone is patient enough to go on for the ride. Nabokov's writers working on exactly how many things are truly at play and often hidden in the source text. He brings up the author's literary influences. For example, even though Pushkin was writing in Russian, he actually studied in French schools and read a lot of French texts. So you can't simply say that you're translating from Russian when his larger literary influence was actually a French one. The conventions for poetic forms in one language versus another will never have the same effect, in that you cannot, say, translate a poetic form into an English sonnet, another poetic form, in anticipation that one popular poetic form swaps for another poetic form, because each has its own distinct music. Thirdly, most words carry slightly different connotations and additional meanings than what would be the easiest and most obvious choice in the target language. He goes on this tangent about the word progolki, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right because I can't speak Russian, but as get some air, perhaps, even though that doesn't quite do it. But the point was that you can't simply choose the most obvious word, because there's connotations and often additional meanings onto every single word that make it impossible to do quite that. And now we're getting to my favorite aspect and conclusions from the problems of translation, and that is he introduces the notion of a dense translation. I want to note that St. Jerome actually did this first. His insane annotated version of the Vulgate was an example of this, in which he had cross-referenced the Hebrew against the Greek and annotated the entire thing. That's a very dense translation technique, but dense translation outside of a religious context was not something in full form or something that was practiced. My favorite contemporary example of dense translation is a book called Ruin by, it was translated by Luke McMullen, and we have no idea who the original authors were actually. But to summarize, the translation takes this tiny scrap, this fragment that we have remaining of Celtic ruins, and imagines a myriad of different translations for it, knowing that there is actually not one translation and that there's so many possibilities given that half of the text is gone, or we don't know much about the authors at all. And there's a lot of things to be extrapolated from the absences of the text. He's then created something that was initially so sparse and fragmentary into something that is incredibly dense. So Nabokov introduces this notion of dense translation with this idea that you can have a little bit of translated text and it will be mostly footnotes. He also proposes an unprecedented visibility of the translator, which is in stark contrast to Anne Dacier's stated intent to disappear behind the author. But rather than imposing their own style to the text, because he doesn't want to do what the French were doing, right? He doesn't want the translator to impose their style onto text. He wants the translator to appear alongside it in the footnotes and in the margins. He also, or we could also say from the conclusion of Problems of Translation that our primary concern when translating should not be whether or not it is pleasant to the English-speaking ear. In fact, there's arguably more value in something that is disruptive. This point, of course, does not have a lot of traction in editorial boardrooms in major publishing houses in America. But smaller presses, of course, are playing with this idea. And then lastly, a translator does not work only from the language, and language is in capital because the larger language, in this case, Russian, but also from the very personal language of the author. That is, in Pushkin's case, someone who grew up in Russia, but also studied French and read a lot of French texts, who also traveled a lot and was concerned with very particular themes in literature. That creates its own language. And the translator is not only working from Russian, but therefore from a very personal language of the author, which may require an exhaustive study of their life and body of work. So translation theory, going forward, is a very exciting, adventurous thing. I think there's a lot of interesting scholarship. All of them fall on the spectrum of the practicing translator versus a translation theorist who's perhaps looking at the archive of translation that has already been done. But personally, something that I like to bring up at this point is something that was said after a reading of a new translation of Marguerite Duras. The two translators who co-translated the project together said that we are actually in a sort of golden age, at least when we're working in English, and we could argue that it'd be nice to have more effort to translate into other languages aside from English, but there's definitely an impulse and desire because English is so forgiving. English is a very malleable language. The structure is not nearly as rigid as, say, French or Italian, in the sense that there isn't an accordance of gender. There is much more freedom when you're talking about past, present, or future. In a sense, English is the perfect language to realize Goethe's dream of translating something in an interlinear way in this such that it changes and alters and messes with a bit the language that it's being translated into, while still maintaining this sort of edgy readability. I'm going to check the time here. Okay. How are we doing? Should I open for questions?
Ma'am, thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was indeed remarkable. Now the floor is open for discussion, and if there is anyone who has any queries or questions, you may please post in or you may please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi Janet. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed listening to your talk about it. It's a pleasure, listening to somebody who's an active translator. I teach a bit of translation. You ended with the book by Lawrence Venuti. So we do a little bit of that in college as well. I teach some of my students about the theory of translation. So it was quite an eye-opening thing, listening to translation from somebody who's an active translator. I just have a couple of questions that I want to pick your brain on. So this idea that sometimes, I think this comes from Eugene Nida, the idea that sometimes, I think he makes the claim that sometimes translating from languages that are related are more difficult than from, say, languages that are not really related. So you are an active translator from French into English. Do you consider that to be an easy task? Do you think English, would you say that it's a more difficult task than, say, from translating from Arabic to English? Because I asked this question because in some sense, this question of fidelity is central to translation, right? So there's this argument that says that, sometimes a translation is a corruption. So you should not attempt a translation. In fact, you should try to augment it with as many notes and footnotes and try to be as objective as you can and efface yourself completely from the project of translation itself. Or you could say that, that is because subjectivity is inevitable. So you should not even try to aim for an objective sort of a translation, and you should instead lean into it and hope that it enriches the translation rather than corrupt it. Right. So my question is, as students of humanities or teachers of the humanities, you are exposed to texts from so many different languages. And I'm confused about this because, for example, you have to learn about German authors and their philosophy of writing or composition or whatever. So, for example, when we teach literature, we have to talk about Lacan, Jacques Lacan. Right? And Lacan talks about something called jouissance. I don't know French, so I hope I'm not pronouncing it too wrong. Right? And
that's fine, yes.
Yeah, so we understand jouissance to be something like ecstasy, right? But I'm not sure if with which he mentioned it, because when you read more about Lacan, you get the sense that when he says jouissance, he's talking more about the possibility of the satisfaction of a drive. It's very for that into virtue. I would like to get your response on this.
Translating from French has developed over the course of a very literary culture. Is true if you're looking at Quebecois or any of their territories, actually. There's a real love for the language and there's a love for literature and the way that they define, and Derrida is one of the hardest taken as translators. And by the way, you may as well learn French and just read the original Derrida because it's impossible to translate into English. But in a practical sense, even though I know that there's a lot of words that when I rub English up against it, it doesn't quite spark. It's not quite doing what the French did. In a practical way, I also know that my friends who translate from Japanese are spending much, 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 much more time than I am on a single page. they will spend upwards of an entire week on a page, whereas I will spend maybe 2 hours if it's a very difficult page, if it's a very difficult 250 word page. I guess I should asterisk that with that being a standard translation and a sort of middle language author who isn't trying to do anything especially poetic. I think also that the more you learn a language and the more fluent you become in that language, the more it truly registers how difficult your task is. I started learning French at age 22. I am now a good decade plus past that, but 10 years in the language is what I would call upper intermediate. I know that there's still a road ahead of me in terms of attaining true fluency, and along that road, I'm going to truly register how difficult it is actually to translate from French. I don't even fully have a consciousness of how difficult it can be or how difficult it will be. So that's a lovely question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned Derrida, because that's also the thing that came into my mind when we're discussing translation, because in some sense, it's not really a problem of translation, is it? It's actually a problem of communication. Because in some sense, when you're trying to speak to someone, you're automatically translating. You're translating your thoughts into words, and sometimes that fails. And I guess that's why people claim that it was so difficult to talk to Derrida, right? Because it's a part of the philosophy that he was trying to kind of highlight. Because to explain deconstruction would would defeat the very purpose of, a concept like deconstruction. So, he would speak to, I heard stories that he would get very frustrated with his interviewers, and he would say that you'll never understand what I'm trying to tell you. Because even by trying to explain, his philosophy, he would be undermining the philosophy itself. So shouldn't, I think it's this problem that we have with translation is actually a problem inherent to language itself.
I think that's an excellent point, because what you suggested earlier in terms of translation perhaps being a very subjective activity, and we should just lean into the subjectiveness of it. Mm-hmm. And then if we refer back to what I mentioned about Nabokov, his acknowledgement that we're not just translating a language, we're translating an individual language at the individual level of very on the one side of the author, on the side of the author, very subjective experience of the author, and our subjective understanding of that subjective experience, which is to say, of course, there's going to always be a million ways to translate. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Derrida, where perhaps there wasn't very many people actually who could truly register his subjective interpretation of reality, that would make the translation inherently that much harder.
Right. And what do you think about machine learning and AI and other things that's kind of taking over this whole project? Do you think that that's possibly a better way of trying to embark on a project of translation, or will it never measure up?
I consider machine translation an excellent tool. As an active translator, I refer to word forums, large depositories of translation and language, and aggregations of text. I refer to a lot of there's a site called Linge, which translates often a lot of legal and medical texts. Problem is, if you put something in Google Translate, I'm spending so much time reworking the text that it's almost faster for me to just translate it initially instead of going through the trouble of editing a machine translation. And this becomes more and more true if you're working with a literary text. If I do this every once in a while, and actually just yesterday, I just copy and pasted the first line from a newspaper article from Le Monde and just dropped it into Google Translate to see how it would do in English, or how Google Translate would translate it into English. And it was It was understandable. It was weird, but it was understandable. It just took, some rearranging and swapping one word out for the other and, just reorganizing it a little bit. But it was still enough time doing that, as a translator, it would make more sense for me to just translate it directly myself. And that was with a newspaper article. Once we start looking at more complicated texts, that time just increases. And so in my mind, machine translation is still at the point of where they were at even previous to 300 AD, when translators were like, we don't do word for word translation. That just sounds clunky and weird. I think machines are millennia behind us, because what it takes to translate well, at least a literary text, you have to be able to read well. You have to be able to retain in your mind what happened a couple sentences ago to continue to convey a sort of through line and rhythm. You have to understand the atmosphere that's being created, whether it's a somber atmosphere or whether it's a joyful atmosphere. You have to be able to do that. And a computer isn't going to be making those choices just yet, because they can't read that way. I don't doubt that we'll eventually start doing some interesting things in that field, but I haven't seen anything just yet that quite replaces a human translator.
All right. Thank you so much. It was nice talking to you.
Of course. You too.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Wimble John, for the warm question. And thank you, Janaki. Yes.
Hi, Janet. Thank you for being with us. I have a question for you. So I want the answer to be subjective. I want the answer to be drawn out from your experience. You said you translate French texts to English, right?
Yes.
It must have been a few years since you started translating French works into English, I suppose. So where do you place yourself now when you compare you with your younger self in terms of the quality of your translated works?
It's considerable. And it's funny because I almost started in a place where if you look at the circle I had for Goethe's ideal translation, on one point of the circle was a simple prose translation. I very much started as a translator almost afraid to let go of the French. I clung very tightly to the syntax, to the grammar. The words I almost half the time wanted to simply keep in French and just italicize them in hopes that the English reader would just get it, because there's a real anxiety knowing that the translation will not be the text. And what's devastating as a new translator is that the reason you got into translation is because you loved the original text so much. And you want to share that with people. You don't want to share necessarily something subpar. So part of it is that even though, of course, the translated text won't be the original text, I'm at a place now where I feel that I'm not just translating, I'm actually providing a very engaged read of something that was very impactful, not just to me personally, but often to a large group of people, often to a large French reading public. Being able to now, I'm at a point now where I can defend why I make certain translation choices. I'm at a point now too where I have an idea of what I want it to look like, even if it's really hard for me to successfully achieve that. And I hope that my work going forward, there is an increased sort of fluidity and more intuition and more natural mode that I feel more comfortable slipping into when I'm greeted with a new text in the future.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for sharing your experience. And have you
Thank
ever
you.
translated poetry?
I have, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm working on poetry now.
Okay. Translating poetry and prose works both are totally different, right? So, how
Oh,
do
yes.
you perceive that difference?
I would say that prose takes much less time because the stakes are lower. Of course, there's a lot of beautiful prose that has poetic elements, and you can usually isolate those elements and recognize there's some nice rhythm in the sentence, or there's some beautiful metaphors happening. But poetry, it's because it's so often, with contemporary poetry anyway, it will sometimes only be a page. A poem might even only be a couple lines. The stakes are much higher because you're supposed to somehow convey in a matter of 5 lines sometimes the emotional punch of perhaps being lost, or perhaps losing or regaining faith, or having like a sort of sense of disbursement, or sort of like ego dissolve. There's a lot of crazy, wonderful concepts that poetry will convey in a matter of 5 lines, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, but we're not given too much more. I have not translated and published any of the poetry I've been working on because I continue to rework them. I'll just say that it's much, much more difficult. The stakes are much more high. A lot of translators I talk to about this say that, at some point you do have to throw in the towel and be happy with the idea that it's not the same poem, not even close, not even proximate to it. It's something that stands by itself, but it's a feeling in response to a feeling, a sort of echo. In fact, that's my favorite metaphor for it, is that translating poetry isn't necessarily a translation as much as it is an echo, and one emotion responding with another emotion.
Gotcha. Thank you, Janet. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Just now, I think that's okay. Maybe we can move on to the next session, next part of the talk.
Thank you so much.
Just now, we can continue with the session.
Ma'am, I guess we have 2 questions right now.
Okay.
Okay, then go ahead and ask them.
What qualities would a translator require?
I'm sorry, what qualities? I missed some of the question.
If they would like to become a translator, I think that's what they're saying. What would be what would be ideally looked for in a translator?
If I understand the question, it was what sort of qualities is looked for in a translator? Oh, okay. I've that of a very thoughtful reader, not someone who simply reads or reads quickly, but someone who can linger over and consider the text in a slow, meditative way, to see things and to analyze how things are working in the text. It's a form of reading that's not necessarily taught in school because you're often encouraged to read things very quickly. You have a lot of things to read, a lot of things to get through, of course, as a student. But it's very, very helpful as a translator to learn how to slow down and read very, very slowly and meditative in a meditative way. Then secondly, I would say being able to write, quite simply. And you don't ever want to impose your own style. So it means a sort of writing that is perhaps more like the way an actor would use their expression, in that you've fine-tuned your writing to the extent that when you're greeted with a script, as an actor would be greeted with a script, you can then perform in English, writing in English. And of course, I would also say a willingness to advocate for your author. Most translators are also sort of literary agents, and having that sort of expectation that you're going to have to advocate for your work and meet with editors and try to convince them to take on the project. A lot of those people skills of what a literary agent does is something that is very, very useful as a translator.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. That was actually one of our students. And participants, are there any more questions? I believe we have one more question from one of our students.
Hi, Janet. My name is Divine, and I have a question for you. Could you mention some of the career opportunities in translation?
Absolutely. So I come from a background in literary publishing. My first job in publishing was that of a foreign rights literary agent. And while you're not doing translation every day, it's something that is very valued and desired as a skill set. If you are working as a foreign literary agent in publishing, if you want to work with literary texts. I then started to work as an agent myself, which again, if you're working with literature and you want to continue working with literature, is it's a very profitable and a very fulfilling role to take on. It allows you to read a lot, but then it also allows you to translate as part of your work in order to convince American editors to take on a project. And also, of course, allows you to collaborate with other translators and to try your hand at editing translations, which is also a skill. If you're looking beyond literary translation, there's so much opportunity. Almost every single governmental branch, of course, this is from me coming from the perspective of analyzing the job market in New York City, but almost every single governmental branch requires an active interpreter and an active translator to translate on an almost daily basis large legal documents and communications for public consumption. And again, those roles are in high demand, usually well paid. And I definitely have quite a few translator friends who enjoy the work and have been doing that for a long time. I'd say the most profitable of them all, however, is advertising. I have a couple friends who work for L'Oreal and another friend who works for Uniqlo, both large brands. And their jobs consist of a form of translation that's called localization. It's not exactly translation, it's repurposing advertising for a particular market. So the same sort of advertising that doesn't work for, say, Uniqlo in Japan how that is changed and reworded and revamped for an English market. It requires a lot of flexibility, a lot of skill in translation, but also a lot of copywriting skills, a lot of graphic design know-how, but it's really, really fun. And a lot of people very, very much enjoy that work.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. And thank you, Divine. And I believe we can now close the session for the valedictory, for the ending note. Before that, thank you, ma'am, for introducing us to the major theorists and the diverse aspects associated with translation, including the difference between word by word and sense by sense translation, plain prose translation, parodistic, interlinear, among many more. And if academia is a knowledge hub, it is invited guests and people like you who are the main routers and sources that teachers like myself look up to learn and grow from. Thank you for sparkling our event with your wisdom, and we definitely hope to learn and grow from you. And thank you, participants, for your interesting questions and engaging conversations. And thank you, Shruti ma'am, for the introduction as well. Every event is an experience. The external fades away, and the internal lingers and echoes in the most depth of our hearts. We're reminded that events like this one are milestones on the journey of life and reminders of God's fidelity all through. And as we come to the close of our lecture, I invite Ms. Nia Matthew, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor, to propose the word of thanks. I'm sorry, I just saw right now there is a question by Sayana Sam. Yes. Sayana Sam has asked if she could ask one more question. Yes, you're free to do that. If Janet
I had
is okay.
one more question. If there is time, then only I'll ask.
I'm good for time if everyone else is.
Then absolutely.
Okay. Janet, as students, we often read and study translated works. So due to the lack of knowledge in many languages, we don't always get to read the original texts. So keeping it in your mind, do you have any advice to give to us, that is to the active readers of the translators, if you have any advice to give?
Absolutely. If you enjoy reading translations, it's good for yourself to define why that is. If you're enjoying themes or perspectives from a particular part of the world, or if it's a matter of, if you're reading in English, a matter of the language sounding strange and beautiful in ways that it doesn't normally sound, for yourself kind of defining why the translation reads as it does and why you enjoy it is a really wonderful exercise. I also think it's a good idea to eventually, if you are interested in translation and you're interested in reading translation, to eventually start learning the language that you're interested in reading. Because it's a lot of fun comparing translations and engaging with translations that way, even if you're not fluent. Simply having an understanding, a foundational understanding of the words and idioms and expressions in the language and culture you're very interested in will make translation actually much more enjoyable to read.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sayana, and thank you, Janet ma'am, for answering the question as well. And over to Nia ma'am for to propose the word of thanks.
Just before Nia ma'am talks, I'm just asking all the presenters to be ready for the competition. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. We at Translator College, Uzhavoor, perceive Quaesitio as a collaborative platform that facilitates our desire to further the scope of research and improve awareness about the possibilities of literary studies. And today, I am Nia Matthew, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, and it is with much pleasure and gratitude that I stand here to mark my word of thanks to all of you who've come together and made the Quaesitio of the Department of English 2022-2023 possible. We are extremely happy and privileged to have a renowned literary translator, Ms. Janet Elizabeth Lee, with us today. Your talk on the theory of literary translation has furthered the zenith of knowledge of all the participants, I'm sure. Thank you for helping us explore the history of translation, starting from St. Jerome through your structured presentation. In a time when translation studies, you talk that has introduced so many nuanced concepts within literary translations and hopefully spark the desire to translate in many of us. Holding on to the thought you mentioned, that there is not just one translation, but the various possibilities of translation, I extend to you, Ms. Lee, my sincere gratitude on the behalf of Quaesitio organizers and the Department of English, St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor. I extend my gratitude and appreciation to my colleague, the Chief Coordinator of Quaesitio of the Department of English, Ms. Tina Jose. It is her persistent and endless efforts that has made this year's Quaesitio of the Department possible and successful. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, I extend my gratitude to our pillar of strength and constant motivator, the Department Head, Ms. Lydia Molpankichan. My sincere gratitude to the management of St. Stephen's College, Uzhavoor, our principal, Dr. Stephen Matthew, and Mr. Arvind Cattle, and the organizing committee of Quaesitio 2022-23 by Dr. George. I also extend my gratitude on behalf of the program organizers to all the faculties of the Department of English who has worked behind this to make this event a success. A special mention of gratitude to of my colleagues, the MC of the session, Ms. Jessica Dose, and through the elders who introduced our team. Sincere gratitude to the management of St. Stephen's College. I conclude by extending my sincere gratitude to all the participants, students, and judges present here, and I wish you a very fruitful session of presentation next. All the very best, and thank you.
Thank you, Nia ma'am, for your warm words. So we have now reached the end of our event. Ends are not bad things. They just mean that something else is about to begin. And there are many things that don't really end, but they just begin again in a new way. I'm pretty sure that today's lecture, and indeed the conference as a whole, was successful in disseminating knowledge and enlarging skylines by acquainting scholars with the diverse array of the specialists in different disciplines from across the world. Once again, I shower my heartfelt gratitude to an eminent resource person, Ms. Janet Lee, professors, research scholars, students, and knowledge seekers from other institutions, and everyone of Stephan and family for the wholehearted support rendered in the success of this event and for the series throughout. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time and presence. And once again, a big shout out to all the leaders for putting this together, and my best wishes to all the participants. So now the official ceremony has now come to an end. The paper presentation competition will be beginning soon. And now Ms. Tina Jose will be taking over. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jasna. We are going to go forward with the paper presentation competition. Before that, I call upon Anita Sabu to introduce the judges to us.